Well, is this working? Okay, great. So thanks so much for coming out on this horribly hot day. And so we're just going to do this sort of like an interview. And first I want to say congratulations on your book birthday.
Thank you.
And it's wonderful to see somebody writing about activism in this area, which has been it just, people haven't talked about it. So, but first I just want to ask you, why did you write this book?
You know, it was about 18 months ago. I'm from Pasadena, California. I was in Vromans. I had just lost another one of my friends. And I went into the local bookseller, and I was really just kind of vigorously looking for something on this topic, not on necessarily just opioids or like the train wreck of an addiction story or an addiction memoir. I wanted to find a book that was going to kind of give me some inspiration, you know, talk to me a little bit about the movement, and then tell me what to do. I mean, and I couldn't find it. I went to social science, I went to political science, I went to addiction memoirs, and everything pretty much seemed more or less the same. And I didn't identify, so I came home that night and just started taking some notes. And that was really the start of the project.
Yeah, no, and I mean, as somebody who's followed this for a really long time, I can tell you that there has been also a lot of pressure within publishing to not make this political. You know, when I and others have tried in the past, it has been really, really difficult to get that past gatekeepers. So I'm really...
I do want to, I have, this is an interesting story. So full disclosure, I'm a liberal Democrat. You know, I was a DNC delegate. You know, I worked in the Clinton White House. I've done a lot of work with the Obamas. And when the book proposal went out last spring, it went out to everybody. And we got a couple of, you know, hits back, but the person who actually ended up settling on it was Adam Bello, who, you know, yes. Adam formerly was a very conservative book editor, and now he runs All Points Books at St. Martin's. And he came to me, he was like, this is just fascinating. He's like, from a political perspective, it's fascinating because it's a uniting issue, and I'd like you to, you know, just tell the story, give your agenda. So it was interesting to, you know, have the editor who had acquired like Sarah Palin's book and Dinesh D'Souza, you know, to say, hey, I want to publish this book. It really showed how transpolitical, you know, this issue is.
Yeah, no, and I mean, it's great to see that. So tell me a little bit about your addiction story. How did you first get addicted, and what was going on with you at the time?
Addicted to opioids, or
well, let's start
use?
a little before that. Like, where do you start? Where do you think?
I mean, full onset of like substance use disorder for me, you know, was definitely when the opioids had kicked in. I certainly, you know, had my fair share of drinking, some recreational drug use as a, you know, college student, high school student, but I wasn't really suffering consequences. I wasn't homeless. I wasn't losing things. I wasn't unemployable. Where it really, you know, took hold of me was in 2003 as a result of getting hooked on opioids and then becoming, you know, a drug user from that.
And so what was it like when you sort of first discovered the opioids? How did that happen, and what did it do for you?
So I broke my ankle 2003. I was on a hiking trip in Virginia.
And how old were you at the time?
23.
Okay.
I was 23 years old. I was hiking, slipped, fractured my ankle, hurt my knee, ended up going to an urgent care physician in the area, and they prescribed me hydromorphone.
Wow. Right,
and a high dose of hydromorphone, which is Dilaudid, if you don't know what that is. And it kind of took off from there. I was supposed to get the knee checked out, but I didn't. I ended up, you know, I kept going back to the doctor for more over the course of a year. I was taking them as prescribed for that first year. But then I ended up moving to Florida. And if you know anything about Florida, in the mid-2000s, it was at the height of the pill mill epidemic. And I got caught up in that very quickly.
Right. And so when you were using it supposedly for your leg, mm-hmm. Did you know that you were getting high from it? Or did you sort of not think that was what was going on?
Eventually, yes, I knew I was feeling something. I had been on opioids before. So just to full disclosure, I had, you know, major surgery 2 years prior, and I was on opioids for the surgery. I was on, I think, 10 days of them, stopped, and didn't have a problem.
Right.
You know, I did feel something different with the Dilaudid. Absolutely.
Okay, so, and why do you think it was different? Was something different in your life, or was something different in the drug, do you think?
The drug was definitely more powerful. I mean, I was taking like pharmaceutical grade, morphine, basically.
Right. And Dilaudid is like twice
Yeah.
as strong as heroin, so yeah.
Yeah.
And you were like swallowing it, you weren't snorting it or that?
Nope.
Right,
No.
right.
Yeah.
Okay, so you moved to Florida, and what happens?
I was referred to a pain management clinic by my primary care physician. Ended up kind of being one of these unscrupulous pill mills that I was really if I knew then what I know now, I mean, I feel so naive knowing everything that I know now, thinking back then, and how ridiculous it is that I walked out of an office with so much medication. I was overprescribed. I went in, saw the doctor, got a ridiculous amount of Oxycontin, oxycodone, very quickly became addicted, and then became a drug seeker.
So when you walked into the pill mill, I mean, during my own addiction, I went to pill mills deliberately,
Yep.
and you pay the doctor for the script. Like you don't, maybe you fill out some forms, but you don't, they don't examine you. They don't really ask what's wrong with you. They don't, look at. So did you think you were getting medical care?
The first one that I went to, yes.
Okay.
That absolutely, 100%. It was in one of the like snazziest buildings in North Miami. You walked in and they had like, a full kind of brunch or breakfast, depending on like what time of day you were there.
How much did this place cost?
I think it was, I don't remember exactly, but I think it was $200 cash. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, it was cash. The first time, yes, but I got hooked really quickly. The subsequent ones, when the doctor shopping went in, and I mean, I knew what I was doing,
right.
Following that, absolutely.
And so, like, when did you start to think you had a problem?
I can remember it was early 2004. I was working on a senatorial campaign in Broward County, Florida. I had been out of my medication for the first time, really, for an extended period of time. I was hitting that 12 hours. I went to my desk. It was a couple of weeks before the Florida primary. I started getting sick. I'm looking at my computer screen. I'm looking down. I'm like, what is wrong with me? I Google it. I start putting everything together, and I'm like, wow, there's something going on here. I went into the bathroom, put water on my face, and I remember looking at myself and said, does this have something to, like, is this what addiction is? Am I addicted? Now, my first thought wasn't like, hey, let's stop and go to rehab and, get some help. No, my first thought was like, how am I going to get better so I can get through the day?
Right.
Yeah.
And so what happened then?
Black market. Yeah. Black market opioids. That wasn't heroin, though. I was doing black market pills.
So how did you end up getting to heroin?
Around 2007, 2008, I walked into one of the doctors that I was seeing at the time, and they recognized that I had was displaying, problems. At this point, I had already been injecting drugs, the pills.
So wait, when did the injecting start?
A few months prior to that.
And how did that start? Because it doesn't, like, in most addiction stories, people are like usually like they're hanging out with friends, getting high. They are, in some kind of drug scene. They don't need to Google their friend says, oh, you're sick.
Yeah. I was living in a sober living home at the time in Florida, which was more of a trap house.
Okay.
Yeah, and my,
So wait, how did you end up in there?
One of the ones when I came out of treatment that I was staying at.
Okay, gotcha.
In Hollywood, Florida.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. And so, all right, so what happened? You go to a doctor.
Doctor says you have a problem. I had already been seeing, 3 or 4 doctors at that point. I showed up on what's called a PDMP, which at the time...
Prescription Drug Monitoring Program.
Prescription Drug Monitoring Program. I was in the PDMP, and I was thrown out of the office. And I was told if I showed back up, I'd be arrested, and that what I was doing was illegal.
And what did the doctor say to you explicitly?
The doctor called me a junkie.
Right.
Yeah, doctor called me a junkie.
And what did you think?
At the time, I was terrified, not because I might get arrested or not because she called me a junkie or not because I was called out. I was terrified because I wasn't going to get my medication. I was sick, and I literally thought I was going to die.
So what happened?
I left, and within a few minutes, I found heroin. And this wasn't just happening to me. This is not unique. I mean, this really is kind of, in my opinion, why we're in this heroin crisis right now.
So literally you walked into the parking lot.
I walked into the parking lot and there was a dealer there. And I mean, this was happening to scores of people that day. And I'm sure many days after.
And so this dealer clearly knew what was up.
Mm-hmm.
And was smart enough to hang out in the, and so, okay, so how did you get into recovery?
I had tried treatment multiple times, different types of treatment. My recovery story really started the day I left treatment. You know, my treatment was a little different. I kind of had to fight to be on, I had to be my own self-advocate while I was in treatment to get on medication-assisted treatment. It was an abstinence-based program that refused to give it to me.
So let's talk a little bit about that. So in case people in this audience probably know, but medication treatment involves the use of buprenorphine, methadone, or Vivitrol, although we'll bracket that for the moment. Mm-hmm. And it the other two medications, if you stay on them long term, are proven to cut the death rate in half.
Yep.
Were you told that by these treatment providers?
No, I wasn't. I went to a center. The doctor, luckily enough, the doctor there was educated. It was an addictionologist who was an advocate for me to get on the meds. The problem was there was no coordinated care in the addiction center that I was at. So the doctor and my counselor were butting heads over whether or not I should be on medication. And I ended up not on medication until I basically threatened to leave because I was going to go get high, and they put me on it.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so, so you were educated a little bit at that point by the doctor.
Right.
And what was the counselor's argument?
That I don't need it.
What? Oh, you don't need it?
That I don't need it, yeah.
Okay.
But I do want to say that I'm kind of living proof that, like, when it's used correctly, I mean, I'm abstinent now, just to be clear. I'm not on medication. I haven't been on medication since, I don't know, like week 10 or 11 of my recovery. But I needed that short-term bridge.
Right.
I probably would have stayed on it a little bit longer if it were up to me when I left treatment, but I couldn't find a sober living. I couldn't find a recovery residence that would take me while I was on it. So I was cut off very quickly. Lucky I fell into a peer community and a support group that helped me save my behind.
Right.
Yeah.
So when did you start thinking about this in a political way?
It was late 2015. My friend Greg passed away. So I was about 6 months into recovery until people just started dropping off like flies. But when it started happening rapidly and quickly, and it was like one after the other, after the other, after the other. Within a span of a couple of weeks, we lost 4 guys that were really close to us.
Wow.
People who are roommates, people I went to treatment with, and then it was every couple of weeks another one was dying. It was right around the time of the presidential election. Mm-hmm. I wasn't registered to vote in California yet. I had this previous career as kind of a community organizer, political organizer. I knew the tactics. I knew what it meant to organize a community. I knew, intrinsically, how powerful activism and voting was on other, social movements. And I just saw this huge gap when it came to this. But I also saw this huge community of young people, not just young, old, cross-section, who are losing friends, losing loved ones, and they're just told that that's how it is.
Right.
Like, you just deal with it.
What do they say in 12-step about that?
Some people have to die so others can recover, and that is a lie. That is a lie.
Yeah. And that made you angry.
It made me angry. It made me outraged. So I registered to vote, and I ran, as a person in recovery, I did it all out, and I said, okay, I'm going to run for delegate to the DNC, but all I'm going to do is talk about heroin and opioids, and we're going to get the community registered to vote, and we're going to organize them, and we're going to do kind of this demonstration project here to see what it looks like. And sure enough, we registered over 100 people who weren't registered to vote, people who had just gotten out of prison, people who didn't think that they could vote, people who really had no reason to vote before, until we started talking about this in a political language, and that your vote is powerful and you can help end the crisis by getting involved as a single issue voter.
And so what did you sort of like, I mean, a lot of people come into recovery and they're like, well, this is the way I did it, so this is the way everybody else should do it, and this is, this is how it should be. How come that wasn't your story?
Well, it was.
Okay,
in the beginning. I was, very much evangelizing my pathway in the beginning because that's all I knew. Look, I was 36 years old at the time. I didn't know anything other than that type of recovery, right? And I am still a 12-stepper today. But it's all I knew. It's all I was taught. It wasn't until my best friend, Garrett, who's here, and I traveled the country. We went to 22 states in 30 days, over logged 8,000 miles, visited with communities of recovery all around the country, and saw that, in all reality, 12-step is like a very small part of the recovery pie, pathway pie. There's a lot of other ways that people do this, and it opened my eyes. And I also saw the stigma that exists within our 12-step world.
And specifically around medication.
Specifically around medication or any other pathway that's not 12-step.
Right. Yeah. And so when you sort of were like, okay, I'm going to take this like political. I mean, I remember in my own experience in the early 90s when everybody was dropping from AIDS. I would go and try to talk to people, and they're like, that's an outside issue. And like, I'm like, well, the gay community's organizing. Like, why aren't we doing anything, And it was very frustrating. Did you encounter that kind of thing?
In the beginning, I did. Yeah, absolutely. In the very beginning of this, I did experience some people, and I still do today, who are saying, hey, this isn't a political issue. Hey, this isn't something that you should be involving politics in. And the answer to that is, you're right. Personal recovery, my personal recovery, your personal recovery has nothing to do with politics. But access to recovery, access to healthcare, access to treatment, access to harm reduction services, access to naloxone, early intervention, prevention, all the things that will lead us to recovery is highly political.
Woo! You just put it perfectly. And I mean, I would get a lot of accept the things you cannot change, and politics is one of the things you cannot change. And so like, I'm really glad to see people like taking that up now and recognizing that, we need a kind of ecumenical recovery movement in order to really help people get better. A lot of people, there has been a lot within the abstinence community, a lot of opposition to things like needle exchange and safe injection sites and that sort of thing, and naloxone. What was it that made you sort of realize that, hey, like this isn't enabling, this is something that's like a good idea?
So my own personal experience, I'm currently just finishing up treatment for Hep C. As of like last week, I'm cleared of it, but I have to finish the 4 weeks. I mean, it's something that I contracted as a result of not having access to harm reduction services. I have come to, through personal experience, I lost a really good friend of mine who didn't have access to naloxone. Back in October, it outraged me. I'm working on some legislation now, federal and also state, that would hopefully change that. I didn't realize the stigma that existed with harm reduction until I started going to sober living homes in my own community and saying, hey, my friend Tyler just died, because he was paying $1,500 a month cash to this place, and they didn't know how to respond to an overdose. They didn't have naloxone on site. So let's change that. Let's make, in what world is it okay? Would this be okay for you to send a diabetic to assisted living without insulin? No, of course not. That makes no sense. Right. So why is it okay to have somebody with opioid use disorder at a sober living home without Narcan? Treatment centers and sober living homes I think we visited well over 20. Only one of them let us we wanted to train the actual patients. We wanted to train the people who were there. We were only allowed to train one of the centers because everybody else said that having it on hand was going to enable and it was going to encourage use. And it's just this stigma that has to be broken. And I don't know how many more people have to die, how many more people that I know personally that I'm working with have to die before we change that.
No, I had, I'm sure you probably know this person, a woman named Louise Vincent, who she herself is had an addiction, and her daughter was addicted, and she wanted to like help her daughter and get her into treatment, and her daughter agreed to go. She had been trained on naloxone. She did all the harm reduction stuff. She knew everything. She died of an overdose in that rehab where her mom sent her to be safe. And it's just like, right, if you have a bunch of heart attack patients, why wouldn't you have a defibrillator?
But that's why and when I talk to people in recovery, and when I talk to communities of recovery and parents and people who are affected, that's why the political part of this is so important. So just last week, since Tyler died, the response to that from me and my community was let's write legislation, let's find an author where we could change this. Right. And we wrote a bill in California, SB 1228, that provided for minimum standards for sober living homes are unregulated. Right. They're unchecked. There's no oversight in our state, at least, and I know many others. And we wanted to change that with a voluntary certification that included overdose response, mandatory overdose response plans, access to naloxone, some financial transparency, because we're also consumers and we deserve not to be ripped off and taken advantage of. Man. Some stuff in there about, mandatory reporting of deaths, mandatory reporting of sexual abuse, simple stuff in the state of California. We think this would be an easy thing to get. Well,
you have these weird cancer regulations that everything causes cancer.
And we also had an anti-patient brokering provision in there, which was really important. It passed, many committees unanimously. It got to appropriations. It didn't cost much money. Governor's office said that they really were against it because Department of Healthcare Services was against it, and Brown kind of, he sent a signal that he would veto the bill, and the Appropriations Committee killed our bill last week. Ugh. And this is in blue liberal California.
Well, and he's horrible on drugs and has always been horrible on drugs. I never understand why people see him as liberal, because he's always been such a drug warrior. But that's just like how, I mean, and I think this kind of gets at like the larger point that I know you make so well in here, just about, people with addiction being human and valuable, and lives that we want and need to save if we want to have a thriving community of all of us. I mean, one of the things that I'm sure you saw in your, travels is the amazing diversity and amazing intelligence and creativity and kindness of people, with addiction.
Yeah, I mean, we are definitely some of the most kind, creative, compassionate, innovative thinkers out there. I mean, my friends are incredible, and the people, the friends that I've lost were incredible, and it hurts every single day to watch what's happening to our community. I mean, we're definitely worth second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, whatever it takes. Chances.
Yeah, well, I mean, we don't ask this question. Like, I mean, there was a New York Times headline maybe a couple of weeks ago where it was like, drugs can hurt your heart. How many chances should an addict get? It was about endocarditis. And it's like, first of all, there's no shortage of endocarditis treatment. It's not like a transplant. So there's not even a question of rationing.
I mean, Big Macs can hurt your heart. How many, heart attacks is somebody's life worth?
Exactly. I mean, like, it's just like no newspaper would even dare ask that question of any other group of people. And so, so it's just really great to see people actually, getting active around this. So, I mean, one of the things that you and I have talked about in the past, and that has sort of been a challenge for recovery activism, has been pain. And the fact that, a lot of pain patients actually do benefit from opioids and are now being, cut off and treated very poorly. And then they're like, we're not like those scummy people, which is a problem. But, I mean, so there has been this narrative, which your story fits into to some extent, where, it's like, well, if we just don't give the opioids, we'll solve this problem. So what do you say to like some of these pain patients who are like, now struggling because of the crackdown?
I think that legacy pain patients, we should really be leaving them alone. Legacy pain patients. That being said, I think that a lot of this falls on prescribers, and I believe that prescribers are really uneducated when it comes to treating pain the right way, and also when it comes to recognizing the symptoms of a substance use disorder or somebody who might have a problem. And I think this narrative of, pain patients versus recovery advocates can be solved. And I think that there is a path forward for both communities. I think that it takes getting those communities to the same table. I think that, I've had multiple conversations with some of the leading pain activists that are out there, and we have a lot more in common than we have that divide us. And I think that there's this media narrative that likes to cut us right down the middle, and tries to make it look like we all hate each other. And that's not the fact.
Well, and I mean, one of the things that that is also a problem for people with addiction is not only are people cracking down on doctors who prescribe opioids for pain, they're cracking down on doctors who prescribe buprenorphine and methadone.
Right.
Like the former head of the American Society of Addiction Medicine just got the FBI raiding him for he wrote the buprenorphine prescribing guidelines, and now he's getting arrested for supposedly he's not arrested yet, but investigated for bad prescribing, supposedly.
And I'm not familiar with that specific case, but I will say more generally, we need to be, increasing access and telemedicine access for buprenorphine for people, that choose or are qualified for MAT. I think also we need to be giving recovery people way more choices than we are right now, and that includes all pathways. I think that there's just this narrative, and it happened to me when I tried to get sober multiple times. It's happening to people today. You go to addiction treatment, and they shove one pathway down your throat, and that could be 12-step, that could be MAT also. It's like we need to be looking at a much more person-centered approach, with wraparound behavioral health care support services that fits that person's specific needs. A doctor needs to be involved, peers need to be involved, professionals need to be involved.
Right. I mean, and I think one of the sort of sad things about the current addiction treatment system is that it is both too intensive and too not intensive. So some people, in order to access medication, they got to do counseling, they got to do all this other stuff that they're not ready for and they're not interested in. Meanwhile, some people desperately want those services, but they can't access them because we're forcing those other people into them.
Have you looked? There's a great, I believe it's still in pilot, it's up in Philadelphia, RAISE Project. So the RAISE Project, I'm a big fan of, right? People can go in there, they can get their MAT services. They're given the option of a peer support specialist to go with the MAT services. They can decide whether or not they want that. They still get the services, but they're given more than just, a silver bullet solution.
Right.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think with any complex mental and or physical, illness, it's not just the condition, it's all the social stuff that goes around it that it's going to help people, get better. So one of the other huge issues, obviously, in this area is that, everybody these days sort of talking about stigma, and we got to fight stigma. Well, how do you fight stigma when you're simultaneously creating it by criminalizing addiction?
My answer to that, I think for me personally, the way to fight stigma is to get ahead of it. I mean, we have to start identifying as people in recovery. More parents need to start identifying as proud parents of someone in recovery, parents of loss. I think I could have broken a tremendous amount of stigma if I would have identified as a drug user when I was using, way earlier on. There would have been way more empathy that would have been involved. It's still our public enemy number one, defeating stigma. I think the only way to combat it is to come out of the closets, to be more open about it, to kind of smash this misconception of what anonymity really is. There's historical precedent for what happens with movements when more people start identifying for what they truly are, and I think that's exactly the case with this one.
No, I agree with you 100%. I also think we should stop criminalizing it as well.
No, we absolutely need to stop. I mean, that goes without, without mention. Yes, of course we need to stop criminalizing it 100% across the board.
Yeah. No, and I mean, I think, but the point about people coming out is so important. Now, so what do you see, what are you doing next first?
Really excited. I mean, it was kind of, the cat's a little bit out of the bag, but I this hasn't just been a book project for me. Like, it's an agenda. It's something that I want to accomplish. I'm not trying to just write a book and go away. We are announcing an initiative it was announced in Forbes, but more of a formal announcement later this week with When We All Vote, which is a new nonprofit to partner on a Recovery Voices Vote campaign, Recovery Voices Count campaign. I have an ambitious goal of registering in the 7-figure number of new recovery voters by 2020. I think it's absolutely possible. You know, we're looking for corporate philanthropy. We're looking for private philanthropy. We're looking for partners. But we've got a really, really good partnership to start with When We All Vote. So, I mean, we want to take this book, turn it into action, create that constituency of consequence, and then we'll see where we go from there. But I think that's the natural next step. Let's actually, you know, take the ideas and turn them into action.
Right. And so in terms of the future of recovery advocacy, what do you see there?
I see more emerging nonprofits, more emerging, you know, advocacy organizations. You know, there's some really great leading national ones. Facing Addiction being, you know, kind of where my heart and soul is. I mean, that's where I cut my teeth, and they're a very special place, special organization. But I see, you know, new recovery advocates. I mean, I see them popping up all over the place, and we need to be more connective. We need to start bringing them in. You know, I'm waiting for, like, if I could go out and teach 1 million people what I do and teach them how to do it, I'd do it in an instant. I think we all need to be doing this, you know, and I think we're just going to see more legislation, more, you know, access to affordable treatment. I think we're going to see a new standard of care when it comes to addiction treatment in the next couple of years. Insurance payers, you know, they need to start paying for addiction treatment. We need to start looking at 5-year continuum of care. There's a lot on the plate for this movement.
No, absolutely. I mean, I'm currently working on an article regarding, you know, how if you're seeking treatment for a family member, like, how do you deal with your insurance? And, right, I see eyes rolling all over the place. Mm-hmm. Exactly. Like, and so I told my editor, this is sort of an impossible assignment because the answer to it is it depends. Right. It depends on your state. It depends on your insurance. It depends on, you know, the day of the week, if somebody's in a bad mood, you know. But yeah, like just that.
Well, I mean, it shouldn't be the fact that I had to walk into addiction treatment. I got scholarship my last time in. My mom helped come up with the last bit of cash for me to go. But the fact that I was literally walking in off the streets, I mean, track marks up and down, had no place to live, probably hadn't eaten in 3 days. I was about 120 or 30 pounds slimmer. I mean, I clearly had a problem, on the verge of dying. And I was told that it was not medically necessary for me to get inpatient treatment for my addiction. Wow. Is ridiculous.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous. We had a friend who literally had to overdose in the doctor's office to get the approval for inpatient treatment. There are so many, the barriers are so high for people to get help. So high when they are ready to get help. And to take it a step further, we have this huge conversation going on about increasing standards of care in the current treatment system, ethics, you know, all insurance payers. At the end of the day, 9 out of 10 people who do need care for their addiction aren't going to get it. Right. Even they're just not going to get it. The doors are closed to them. How do we close that gap?
Right. I mean, we want to.
How do we look beyond treatment? I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah. Well, and also, like, we don't want to pour more money down a hole.
Right.
We don't want to spend more on $58,000 a month for 12-step all day.
Yep.
And so, like, creating those standards and not just saying we need more treatment, we need more better treatment. Right.
We need more better treatment, and I think we also need alternatives to treatment.
Right. And I mean, you know, one of the things that has always been interesting and cool about addiction is that social support is such an important part of it, and different ways of getting that to people really need to be explored.
And I think that, you know, to just drive it back to my narrative, this last go round, what I really got was a detox, and then I plugged into a good recovery residence, right? And I got some health care, and I got a peer support community. I probably could have skipped the whole treatment part and just call it for what it is, which is I was detoxed.
Right.
I was detoxed. I was locked away for a couple of weeks, you know, and that was about it.
Well, I've often thought that what we really need to do is sort of get the bed out of treatment, and like sort of have the people need safe places to live, and people need a variety of different support services. They don't need to be the same place.
Right.
Because when you put them in the same place, often you're ending up getting like one size fits all.
Yep.
So yeah. Well, what is there anything I haven't asked you about before we open to questions that you would like to mention?
No, I want to do some questions.
Okay, let's do
questions.
questions.
Eager for questions. Does
Go
anybody
for it.
have any questions? No?
Don't be shy.
No, it's a big responsibility to go first.
You get a mic.
I'm loud. I don't need a mic.
Okay.
So, can you speak a little bit about like the relationship between trauma and addiction? Because that's something that I've been learning more and more about, especially like reading Gabor Mate's books and Tommy Rose and whatever. And like literally none of the dozens of facilities that my daughter has been at, none of them had trauma therapy. And, they would get one-on-one counseling once a week. So, I feel like if I could go back 10 years, if the real underlying causes of her addiction had been identified, it would have been very different. The last 10 years would have played out very different.
I'll take a quick stab at this, and then so Maya just wrote I'm going to plug this, a great book, Unbroken Brain, and I know she talks about some of this in there. So, but I want to say personally, right, so personally for me, I didn't get trauma treatment either. I mean, the fact that I was, and I think it's actually, there are very few centers who probably give you the appropriate type of trauma treatment that's available. I did not go to any of them. I'm gay. I had a huge identity crisis for quite some time, younger. I know that it, played a part. When I did kind of cross that barrier into addiction, it was a crutch for me to lean on. I know that the rate of substance use disorder, propensity for people to be addicted in the LGBT community is insanely high for that exact reason. So there is definitely a direct connection between addiction and trauma. Now, in terms of the brain science, I'm going to kick it to my friend here because she can explain that better than I can.
Well, so the thing with trauma, so about 2/3 of people with addiction have at least one potentially traumatic experience that could be involved in their addiction. And about 50% also have mental illness, whether it be ADHD or depression or OCD or any of the zillion things it could be. Oftentimes, it's the trauma that turns the predisposition from the for the mental illness into actual mental illness. So it's real, like, having addiction treatment that doesn't provide trauma-sensitive care and also appropriate medical health care, like when and psychiatric. I always say to people who are seeking help and families that you should get a complete psychiatric evaluation first before you go anywhere by somebody completely independent, so that you can get a sense of what you're dealing with. Because a lot of treatment centers are sort of the opposite of trauma sensitive. Like, a lot of times people in the first 30 days, even the first 6 months or the first year, are not ready or able to deal with whatever trauma stuff is going on, but they really do not need to be re-traumatized by treatment itself. Right. And so they really, it needs to be trauma sensitive, and what that means is patient-centered, empathic. People have control over their narrative, so that, like, if they come to a part that's too much, they can stop. All of this kind of stuff that I think we have become a lot more trauma aware. Like when I went into treatment in the 80s, there was sort of attention to trauma, but it was all about, let's dig up how you were sexually abused. And that was not necessarily what you want to do when you have like 2 weeks in recovery. And it ended up like re-traumatizing a lot of people, I think. So it is a crucial issue. It is just really important to realize that, like, people take drugs for reasons, like, and that addiction, while it becomes irrational, does not start in a place of irrationality, and often starts as a solution. So we have to figure out what is this person trying to solve and give them a way to solve that before they're going to be able to get better. And sometimes in harm reduction, somebody is so traumatized that they cannot give up the drugs before they learn the trauma coping skills. And so we need to have that kind of counseling available within harm reduction.
Well, harm reduction is the first touch point for recovery. That's why it's so important. I mean, there's that huge stigma against, we're looking to get the first safe comprehensive user engagement site, the Q.
Overdose prevention site.
Overdose prevention, right?
Language,
overdose
yes.
prevention site in San Francisco. There's in Philly now.
Yes.
And I think that's really kind of the new frontier that we're looking at. And I can't imagine how many more lives we'll save if we could get those in every town, every city across the country.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the main thing about that and about needle exchange and about harm reduction, which a lot of people don't necessarily understand, is it's not even so much about the needle or the fact that there's a doctor there or all of that other stuff, which is life-saving and required. But what makes it work is the fact that people are treated with dignity and respect, and they are not required to be anything else than what they are. And if you are a person, and I know you've experienced this, when you are like homeless and covered with tracks and people are walking on the other side of the street to avoid you, and you go to a place where they're like, hey, how you doing? And it's not about, I want to convert you to this religion, or I want to get you into this treatment center, or whatever it is. It's just like, hey, can we help you be healthier today? I know that like last week you broke up with your girlfriend, like what's going on with that? When you start getting that human stuff, that's when people start getting better.
It also creates trust, I think, for the user and for the clinician that's there. And it leads that person, I think, to a quicker yes to help. I mean, I know for me, had I had access to a center like that, where I didn't feel less than a person, I would have been quicker to say, you know what, if I do want to get help, what do I do? Where do I go? And establish that trust.
And what's so amazing and silly about this in some ways is just that, like, when we're dealing with any other group of human beings, we realize that if we start telling you what to do and start like creating all kinds of bureaucratic nonsense, and who wants to go to the DMV, right? Like, it's like nobody wants to like sort of be told what to do and fill out forms and be all like this. People want to be like welcomed and helped, and they, when that is what is the environment, you'll be less resistant to whatever's on offer just for basic human reasons, and we just don't seem to get that. So we should probably take another one.
We got time for a couple more questions. If you want to raise your hand.
Hey, how are you, Ryan?
Speak louder. You're used to a mic.
My name is Matt. I'm happy to be here. Ryan, I'm a little more curious about your process of writing the book itself. I'm curious if the book that we have here today is the book that you envisioned yourself writing on day one when you first started, and if, within the creative process and your research process, if there were conclusions you arrived at that surprised you, that you weren't sure that you might have even been trying to disprove, or things that I know, curveballs. Like, what were the big curveballs in your process of writing it?
Yeah.
And
thank you. No, in the beginning, that this is not the product that I thought it was going to be. It's not the title that I thought it was going to be. But what I'll tell you is that the book proposal that went out was very much kind of a broad stroke of the opioid crisis, the activist experience, a little bit more of my story. And it went out to, like I said earlier, it went out to multiple publishing houses. One of the other large ones had come back. I did a conference call with them. You will appreciate this. I'm new at all this, so I had a whole team on the phone, and they're like, "Hey, so we love your proposal. We like your chapter 1, but we'd like to hear more of this, and we'd like to hear more of that. And we're going to give you this person that you need to work with, as your editor. But like every 10 pages, you need to send it to them, and we want to know if it's going in the right direction, and we may ask you to make some changes." And I'm like, oh my goodness, this is a lot, Are they going to write it for me too? And it ended up with my editor, Adam Bello, And I had one call with him, and he was like, no, he's like, I want you to write the book that you want to write. And, you know, I'm here to guide you, but we'll talk to you in, you know, 9 months when you have a manuscript, and then we can talk then. And what I didn't know is that I'd be laying out as much of an agenda as I did. I didn't realize that I had that much of an agenda, you know, in terms of what we could do to end the opioid crisis, the addiction crisis, until I wrote it. And at the end of it, I realized that there was really a path forward. I did not expect it to really be as much of a call to action as it turned out to be, but I'm incredibly grateful that I had an editor who pushed me to do that. He said that this is something that needs to be, you know, this is something that needs to be told. It's not just a story that needs to be told, but people need to know what to do. You know, so tell them, you know what to do. And we do know what to do. That's the thing. And it took me a long time. Like, I was very self-conscious about that throughout the whole process. I was like, you know, there's like all these people out there who have been telling me what to do for so long, and how this goes, and, you know, what treatment should look like and what recovery should look like. And, you know, I felt very self-conscious throughout the process of like, is it, you know, is my agenda really what people are looking for? And I think it is. I think it's simple. It requires work. It requires money. But it's not that hard to get done. I mean, if we have the right people making the right decisions for us, we can't keep having people make all these decisions about us without us. That's really what it comes down to. You know, we have to be involved in the decision-making process. There's nothing more frustrating than going to the White House, especially in this administration, and sitting there with like a table of senior policy advisors who have been to Harvard and Yale and MIT and some others in community colleges and things like that, you know, who are going to sit there and they don't know the difference between treatment and recovery. You know, and they ball up the funding. You get money for prevention, you get money for intervention, you get a ton of money for law enforcement and interdiction, and then, you know, treatment and recovery gets the scraps. But it's really not treatment and recovery, it's just treatment. You know, but explaining that is like, you know, it would be easier to drill a hole in my head, you know?
Well, I mean, the incredible thing about our drug policy, and when I started getting into this like very long time ago, I thought, wow, like this is not a hard problem. Like we actually know what to do for a lot of this stuff. The hard problem is the politics of it. The easy problem is like, okay, we need to expand evidence-based treatment. We need to stop spending hundreds of millions of dollars arresting people and making things worse. We need to expand naloxone. You know, just doing those three things would cut this problem in half, at least, right?
Right, but I mean, but look at where we are. So, like, we know what to do. We know how to end the crisis. We know that there's a constituency out there that's affected, impacted. We know that we know how to organize. We can organize. Look at the history of movements. When do things change? Things change when people get involved. Things change when people start to vote. Things change when people start to run for office who use this as a single issue. That's what needs to happen. I mean, that's the history of movements in this country.
I think that, you know, and I completely agree with that. The problem with this area has generally been that drugs are used as a symbol of something else, and that all of our drug policy has generally been made for racist or anti-immigrant reasons that have nothing to do with drugs and everything to do with controlling people.
Yep.
So how do we get that shadow agenda, like, how do we like get drug policy to actually be drug policy?
Well, start with a new administration.
Okay, I'm with you there.
You know, that's
Any
a
other
very
questions
loaded question, but yeah, and we're going back. I mean, decades and decades of drug policy. I truly believe, and I know it's more complex than this, but from my organizing experience, we will never get any better policy until people who understand the policy are making the policy and are ready to make new policy. So how does that happen? That happens through political engagement. We need a drug czar. We need members of Congress. We need people making these decisions that are not going to make them based on, racism and anti-immigrant and things and locking people up. Otherwise, we're going to be stuck with pretty much the same.
Okay, but if we're going to have a drug czar, that person has got to be in health. They have got to
100%.
be out of the law enforcement arena.
Yep.
They've got to be like
Public
at
health.
HHS or something.
Agreed. Any more
So
questions?
I'm just going to add to that.
Hi.
So, I'm going to put this out there. I think those of us that work in the field
Yep.
have to take some onus here too. We let our egos and agendas drive change. And imagine what it would look like if we all were to get together, we're stronger, but we keep on reinventing that wheel. We're competitive with one another. When we join forces, that's when we're really going to make a difference.
Yep.
And whether that's media or the administration that we have now, we're negligent too. We have to stop recreating the wheel and share the best of the best and work together. So I just had to make that comment. How
No, and I agree. I mean,
So-
I agree with that comment. I think that, the recovery movement does need to unify more. I think that, there are, factions of it that kind of work in silos. And Maya and I were talking about this right before, we came out here. There needs to be better organizing. There needs to be better communication. There needs to be more empathy, and there needs to be more unity, and respect. Absolutely, there needs to be more respect. That being said, there are some fundamental things that just are non-starters, I think too. And you can't, there's some organizations that are out there. There's some people out there who are co-opting the word recovery and co-opting the word recovery advocate when that's not really what they are. So if you really are a true recovery advocate or a true, somebody who is pushing for sensible drug policy and are on the right side of this thing, absolutely 100%. We all need to be working together, and there needs to be more respect.
And I mean, this is the story of activism always. Everybody always fights more with each other than with the enemy, and minimizing that is helpful, but ACT UP managed with plenty of infighting.
Yep.
You got one more back here?
One more?
Yeah, Mario.
Is this the last question? Does he get the last question?
Do I get the last one?
Okay. There's one more? Okay. 2 more questions. Okay.
All right. Well, can you
Okay.
come back to me? That want to be the last one.
Okay.
No, I'm just
Yeah,
kidding.
no. Go for it.
Well, first of all, congratulations.
Thank you.
I'm very proud of you. Why wasn't I mentioned in the book? And number 2, when are you going to run, seriously though, when are you going to run for some kind of whether it's drug czar or recovery czar or something? We need you in there.
Yeah, I'm not running for
All
anything. I think that this movement needs to organize itself a lot more before we start getting, I think people should start running for office, but I think my focus right now is going to be on registering a lot of voters. I think we should start getting people elected, but I'm not running for anything.
Well,
I still have,
Wait till you get 5 years.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Wait till I get past that 85%, right? Yes, maybe we'll think about it then.
We have one more over here.
Okay, great.
Was
One
that
more?
you?
Was that?
Yes, I thought that
Were
was
you? Was that you?
Yes, well, I was just going to say, I wanted to ask you, you said you wish you could spend your time educating 100 million people or teaching 100 million people. So
Teaching
I'm sorry, a million people. Sorry,
a million people, yeah.
Sorry, I think big.
Yeah.
A million people.
Registering 1 million people.
Yes.
Yeah. Mhm.
No, not registering. I'm talking about teaching them,
Yep.
teaching a million people. So what is the greatest challenge to accomplish that? How?
Funding. I mean, right now the greatest challenge that we have, I think, is a movement. If I had the funding, institutional funding that other issues have in the health space, whether it be cancer, diabetes, or AIDS, or heart disease, if we had that type of money, we definitely could change the narrative overnight with this. If I could go out and train 1,000 or 10,000 or 50,000 or whatever that number may be, there's just no money to do it right now. So if we had that type of buy-in, where I honestly think it needs to come from corporate America at this point, if we had that
It's
type
not
of
pharma.
yeah, which is not pharma, exactly, which is not, and let me just be very clear about that, which is not pharma. I'm talking about the blue chip companies, the Facebooks of the world, the Googles of the world, the big corporate entities. If they started investing heavily in this space in the right places, we could do a lot of good.
We got one more back here, actually.
Hi. Hi, Ryan.
Hi.
Good to see you. I'm Dara. I feel like I'm in a meeting, whatever. Anyway.
You're not in a meeting.
I know,
I
I'm
guarantee
sorry.
you.
I'm sorry. I'm not an alcoholic. I'm not a drug addict. Or maybe I am. So, anyway, I think that's my hardest thing, that what you were just saying is how do you get the blue chip companies in? How do you get like the not even Facebook. I think Facebook's a different, like a Google or a Nike or like one of those huge companies that will just donate their charitable funds to this movement without being like, I don't want to be the first one to put my feet in the water. And that's what I faced against with Facing Addiction, and now with She Recovers. Like, it becomes so hard to get that company to give their dollar to this movement because they just don't feel the numbers or the reach is there. And that is the hardest thing that I personally deal with in trying to get this moving forward.
And I agree with you 100%. What I've seen on the flip side of that, so I do believe we're actually very close to that moment. I think that it's, you know, I'm new in the new recovery advocacy movement. I know that this has been a struggle for decades for recovery advocates that have come before me, you know, but in the last 18 months, I mean, I think we have come light years, and we are like this close to that major corporate buy-in that really could change that narrative.
All it takes is the right person having their child affected.
It actually, I think it takes more than that though, too, because I've sat in corporate boardrooms across from billionaires whose kids have died from opioid overdoses.
And they need to come out.
Right. And they're just not ready to talk about it. They haven't accepted it, or they are out about it and they just don't want anything to do with the issue. And they don't see the market share. They don't see the purchasing power. All of those things. So I think it's a two-way street. It's also up to us to be loud, to be vocal, to be visible, to come out of the closets, to show that we're consumers, to show that we have buying power. You know, that, you know, there's nothing more frustrating for me as someone who's, you know, coming up on 4 years sober, and the only thing that gets marketed to me is treatment. I haven't needed treatment in 4 effing years, you know? I mean, I buy shoes, you know? I go on vacations. I haven't been on any vacations in a long time. I buy books, you know? I eat at restaurants. I watch movies. I mean, I'm a consumer, but nobody's really talking to me as someone who's in recovery. So whichever one of those brands does step in, and I do really believe with everything in me that we are this close, is going to be a big winner, because we are a huge untapped market. If I was to go into the Nike CEO or any of these major CEOs of major companies and say, hey, Mr. CEO, do you know that there's a market out there of about 45 million Americans that nobody's talking to? As soon as you say addiction, though, it's like, oh. So, I mean, we have an obligation, too, to show who we are and show our cards and use that purchasing power.
Thank you all so much for your questions. Before we get to signing books, did we want to have? Was there a performance?
So Matt, are you doing something? Matt Butler's got like one song he's gonna play.
Absolutely.
And Matt Butler is amazing. I heard him when I was like, I don't know, a couple months sober, and he's gonna play one song for us, I think.
I'm glad that you like it, man.
It's my favorite song.
I think I ask too many questions. I know I'll never understand how to help all those around me. I am just one man. There's so many who feel helpless. Done. But I know it makes all the difference. That revolution has begun. I can help just one. I can help just one. Just one. get something back. So now I'll offer this reflection. While the mourners dressed in black. Lord knows it's so hard to pray. Mercy only comes to some. We seek forgiveness when we rise each day. 'Cause our work is never done. Yeah, we can help just one. We can help just one. We can help just one. If we can help just